Hello everyone, today we're answering a question that came to us this past Sunday in church, and somebody wanted to know what the meaning of the word sanctified is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse number 14. So let me read what Paul wrote there. He said, "For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, else were your children unclean, but now are they holy." So the question they have is, does this verse teach that the believing wife is automatically saving her unbelieving husband, and then also vice versa? Well, if we come down just a couple of verses, let me just read the next couple verses to add some context to this. It says in verse number 15, "But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife?" So you can see clearly in verse number 16 that the believer that in this situation, there is the chance that the believing party would be able to lead their unbelieving spouse to Christ. So Paul says if the unbeliever wants to leave, then you can let them leave. And nothing would be held against the believing spouse in that case. You wouldn't face any church discipline. It wouldn't be any sort of a tarnish on your testimony, nothing like that. But Paul's point is that unbeliever doesn't have to leave. And this evidently was a confusion for the Corinthian church in the early days. They were under the assumption, or at least possibly they were, that now that one member in the marriage is saved, does that mean that the believer needs to divorce or put away the unbelieving spouse? Is it okay to continue on with that marriage? So Paul's answering and addressing that situation. So in verse 16, when he says, you might have a chance as the believing party, the believing spouse, you might be able to lead your unbelieving spouse to Christ. And he specifically uses the word save. You could save your husband or save your wife. So in verse 16, clearly, if you could still save them, then in verse 14, that means that sanctification had nothing to do with the salvation of that unbeliever's soul. So in verse number 14, Paul says the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and then also vice versa, the unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband. In what way? I would say that this is a very practical verse, that Paul is indicating in the home, because there is a believer living in that home, that believer is going to lift the standard, the moral standard of that home, the spiritual standard of that home, and would not allow certain things to go on that might otherwise be happening. And it would certainly influence the children. And I think that's why he says at the end of the verse, else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. It doesn't indicate that the children are saved automatically because one of their parents is saved. I believe what he's saying is that they now have a clean and a holy environment. So I believe that verse 14 is meant to be taken very practically. Verse 16 speaks to the spiritual condition of the person's soul, whether or not they're saved. So to answer the question directly, does the word sanctify indicate salvation in verse 14? Absolutely not. Verse 16 would speak to the salvation of the soul, and therefore verse 14 has to be dealing with something different. So I hope this has answered the question. If there's any other questions about this passage or any other Bible topic, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below. If you would like to click subscribe, you can follow along with our Bible Q&A vlog. If you happen to live in Potch, we want to invite you out for one of our Sunday services, and we hope to see you soon. May God bless and have a great day further.